Greetings, Father Mark signing on. Continuing the series on the history of the Church in the late medieval, early modern period, moving into the reign of Pope 206, Pope Martin V, reigned from 1417 to 1431. Pope Martin was born Odo Colonna, Collonna, born in Genacio, Italy, in the year 1368. His family was ancient, wealthy, and powerful, owning vast lands and commanding the loyalty of thousands of relatives, estate workers, merchants who profited through business with them, and, of course, mercenaries that they employed. It was a house that House Colonna, had at times operated in opposition to the Holy See, as we saw, beginning with a vendetta against Pope Boniface VIII after he demanded that the family surrender one of its members for having hijacked a convoy of papal treasure. And when they refused, he removed two members of the House of Colonna from the College of Cardinals, so that started the vendetta. Odo was a younger son of the family, so he was excluded by the practice of the day, the primogeniture, from inheriting any of the family lands, but in keeping with the feudalism practice, they sent him into the church. He was provided with an excellent education, culminating in a law degree from Perugia. He entered papal service under Pope Urban VI, who was the first pope elected after Gregory XI returned the Holy See to Avignon. Pope Urban gave Odo legal duties, for which he was appointed a Monsignor, a protonotary apostolic, in order to transact business for the papal household. He did well, so he was later admitted to the College of Cardinals by Pope Innocent VII. In papal service, Odo earned a reputation as an astute observer, a methodical worker, and a clear-thinking advisor, combined with the prestige he had just from being a Colonna. Odo Colonna became a favorite of the unique conclave that we covered previously, that was simultaneously session 41 of the Council of Constance, the session opened on November 8, 1417. Because in his dual capacities as a cardinal and a legal advisor, he had already worked with many of those involved in the council, both secular and ecclesiastic. They were impressed by his mixture of prudence and resolve, the vast personal power that he could call upon from his family, was a final element that prompted the selection of this 49-year-old man as the 206th pope. He accepted election 3 days into the conclave on November 11th, 1417. He chose the name Martin V as pope to honor the feast, the St. Martin of Tours, because he was elected on that saint's feast. And as we concluded with last time, Martin formally closed the Council of Constance on April 22nd, 1418. The following month, May 10th, 1418, he issued an apostolic constitution which forbade the appeal of a papal decision to a future church council. Seminarians, remember this, as it will come back again and again. In fact, this prohibition is still embodied in the current Code of Canon Law, the 1983 Code, which seminarians you should be studying. Look it up, Canon 1372. The most enduring legacy of the 14th century papal troubles that endured into this century now, under consideration the 15th, was the erroneous ecclesiology of conciliarism. It came in several varieties. All of them shared the view that a church council was superior to a pope, and a council could act independently of a pope up to and including having the power to depose a pope. In the next papal reign, we'll see how dangerous this ecclesiology could become and did become. Before covering the chronology of his reign, it's important to note that the policy which shaped Martin's pontificate was the use of concordats. That's CONCORDATS. The term concordat is still used today, though the few of them are remaining in effect. It is conventional to define a concordat as a treaty between the Holy See with another sovereign power. Now, that definition is accurate, but it's incomplete. Martin V did not invent the concordat. The first concordat was the Concordat of Worms, signed in 1122 between Pope Callistus II and the Holy Roman Emperor Heinrich V. Martin's methodical legal mind revived and refined the concordat precedent from what it had been, just a periodic convenience to end a specific conflict, and reformulated it into a regular instrument of papal policy in dealing with the outside world. He recognized that the Avignon period and the Great Schism began over a century earlier. So there was no one alive who remembered the papacy of the High Middle Ages. Martin concluded that clearly stated binding legal agreements with each sovereign nation would bring clarity, stability, and order to the temporal affairs of the Church, which he hoped would facilitate improvement in the quality of its spiritual affairs, and therefore its credibility in carrying on its mission. As refined by Martin, a concordat consisted of three separate agreements, three constituent agreements. First is what we normally think of as a treaty. First was just a diplomatic recognition, a diplomatic declaration of mutual recognition in peace between the Holy See and some sovereign power. Second, a financial agreement which regulated the flow of money from within that nation to the Holy See. This would include Peter's pence, tithes, annates, and it would clarify, this second part of a concordat clarified the financial rights and privileges of the Church within that sovereign nation. Did the Church have to pay taxes? If so, how much? How was the procedure? Was it just assessed? Or, as usually was the case, like in France, they went through this whole charade where, the royal treasury would request that the Church contribute to the mission of the sovereign, and that so that. But anyway, that would be put in writing as the second element of the concordat. Third element stipulated the regulations of church operations within that realm, apart from finances. This included the Church's rights in the realm with regard to education of the laity, appointment of clergy, involvement in government. The second and third elements of the concordat are those that subsequently most frequently triggered conflicts between the Holy See and secular rulers. Pope Martin and popes following him were typically prepared to make vast concessions in practical terms to obstinate monarchs as long as a few core principles of papal policy remained intact. Those core principles were the independence of the Holy See, the papacy, the independence of the Church within each country from state control, and third, preservation of correct Catholic doctrine by the Church having the freedom to openly practice the sacraments and teach, what the sacraments really meant. So keep all this in mind. as it explains the otherwise unfathomable papal acceptance of virtual de facto veto power over appointments to bishoprics within various kingdoms. So the church never conceded canonically the right of veto to any monarch, but practically a situation could be negotiated by a concordat which left intact the principle that a bishop was only legitimate if recognized by the Pope, in exchange for the practical concession that the man chosen by the Pope would be one acceptable to a local ruler. So this is where the practice was the Ternae, Ternae. It just means three. So there'd be this process of supplication, where, say, a bishop passed away. Then the cathedral chapter, in consultation with the monarch or whatever bureaucrat the monarch assigned to deal with this kind of stuff, would generate a terna, which is a list of three names. And the king would be, any three of those would be acceptable to the king. And then it was kind of a handshake understanding that the Pope would appoint as bishop somebody from that list. Now that was just a handshake understanding. The Pope canonically never conceded that he was obliged to pick from that list. But more often than not, the Pope did. And so that was just the practical resolution. So with all this in mind, now understanding what a concordat was, during his reign, Pope Martin V negotiated concordats with Germany, France, Spain, England, Milan, Naples, and Venice. He immediately followed this up by establishing permanent papal nunciatures in the capital cities of those nations, making the papal nuncio, which is just the church name for an ambassador, a fixture of the modern Catholic world, a tool of diplomacy, and when necessary, at times, the papal nuncio could be the conduit of direct papal action in a particular country. In this context, while he's negotiating concordats, Pope Martin reached out to the Byzantines, who, remember, was still in schism, Orthodox. He tried to negotiate a concordat with them, and he even offered to travel to Constantinople to hold a reunion council. But the Byzantines considered the suggestion that diplomacy could resolve their centuries-old differences with the West. They considered that to be immature and insulting. So this attempt to repair relations between Roman Catholic and Greek Orthodox failed and would continue into future papal reigns, and it still has not been resolved. 1419, 1 year after Pope Martin closed the Council of Constance, war erupted between the Holy Roman Empire and the Bohemian Hussites. It lasted for decades until 1436. Okay, so the background to this, there's several levels to this. On one level, on a political and cultural level, this was a secession. Bohemia, the present-day Czech Republic, wished independence. It wished to secede from the Holy Roman Empire and just be independent. But our interest is the church aspect of this. So, in that context, the followers of Jan Hus in Bohemia were naturally enraged at his execution by the Council of Constance on July 6, 1415, especially after he had been given a written safe conduct by that council. So this execution of one of their own by a council that they regarded as dominated by Germans enabled the Hussites, the followers of Jan Hus, to garner support from other Bohemians who did not necessarily agree with them in terms of doctrine, but did in terms of nationalism. that they wanted Bohemia to be run by the Bohemians and not by the Germans. This shared ethnic outrage, combined with the pre-existing heretical movement of the Hussite heretical movement, created a situation there similar to that which led to the 21-year-long Albigensian War in southern France, which we covered in the medieval playlist from 1208 to 1229. In that case, the French case, a pre-existing heresy, which was the Manichaean revival called the Cathar movement, synthesized with a previously separate, but now became entwined, previously separate political movement, which sought independence for southern France. That southern France wished to secede from the Kingdom of France and just be its own independent realm. That triggered a conflict that was a combination civil war in the name of political independence with religious war against the authority of the Catholic Church. That cycle repeated in Bohemia as a 17-year-long war from 1419 to 1436. It began as an alliance of Hussite heretics with Bohemian nationalists who resented their subordination to the Germans in the Holy Roman Empire against the secular authority of the Holy Roman Emperor and the doctrinal authority of the Catholic Church. This violent blend of politics, theology, nationalism, and ethnic self-determination erupting into war was a foretaste of what would occur when the cycle repeated during the Protestant movement. Now, as with all heretical movements, Hussites soon manifested ecclesiomitosis. All heretical movements, it's mitosis. They divide and divide and divide and divide. In this case, just to simplify, the moderate Hussites were called the Utraquist, from the Latin term sub utraque specie, meaning under both forms, meaning the bread and wine. So Utraquist is spelled Utraquists. The Utraquist identify themselves based on the four Hussite articles, they said, the four articles based on the teaching of Jan Hus. First, administration of communion under both kinds, the bread and wine, to the laity, that be universally allowed as a right, as a divine right, not something that the church could restrict. Second, that the Word of God, meaning the Bible, must be preached in the vernacular language, openly by priest, as the rite of their ordination, and not subject to limitation by any higher authority, even the bishop who ordained him. Third Hussite article, all civil dominion must be taken away from the clergy. This means stealing church property. And fourth, the faithful are responsible for repressing all public sins rather than the clergy or the Inquisition. So that's the moderate. That's the moderate Hussites. A second faction was the radical faction called the Taborites, Taborits. These were, from the beginning, violent political and religious revolutionaries. They were called Taborites because they named their base, which was south of the city of Prague, they named it Mount Tabor, after the site of the Transfiguration in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 17, which is 5 miles east of Nazareth. The Taborites, in terms of their theology, repudiated the entire Catholic Church as an institutional reality. All of its traditional rites and ceremonies, holy water, holy oils, vestments, feast days, confession, prayer to the saints, belief in purgatory, the use of sacred images, prayers for the dead. Just repudiated all of that. The Taborites had no churches, no church buildings. They incorporated Manichaean dualism in viewing all matter, all material things as intrinsically evil. So, of course, they rejected all the sacraments, especially transubstantiation of the Mass, because all the sacraments have a material component involved. The people they called priests were not ordained in a sacrament, because they didn't believe in that. The people they called priests just wore lay clothing. Instead of a Mass, which the Taborites rejected, they gathered around a table and recited the Lord's Prayer. They shared bread and wine, but without belief that anything supernatural was occurring, just as a symbolic remembrance of the Last Supper. In terms of secular ideology, they were revolutionaries in terms of demanding the abolition of all titles of nobility, the elimination of the court system, and prohibition against taking oaths. The Taborites erupted into violence when news arrived that Jan Hus had been executed. They perpetuated violence, including murder, against priests and nuns out of revenge. They freely engaged in vandalism of sacred art, church property, burning churches, convents, monasteries, activities which both repeated the earlier cycle of the Albigensian War in France in the 13th century and which prefigured the pattern of the later Protestant movement a century later. The Taborites achieved great success tactically, militarily, because their leader, Jan Zizka, Z-I-Z-K-A, of Trocnov, T-R-O-C-N-O-V. He lived from 1360 to 1424. So initially they achieved tactical success because he had prior extensive military experience. He developed tactics that the largely condottieri armies of the time could not overcome. And remember, these now they're not fighting. Condottieri don't want a decisive victory because they want to keep getting paid. But these guys are revolutionaries. They do want a decisive victory. So his innovation was the use of armored wagons, pulled either by horses or teams of men. These wagons held 20 soldiers who fired small arms in parallel rows or small cannons protruding from armored sides. So these wagons could be quickly assembled in order to fire at an enemy formation and then easily move to avoid counterattack or set up to attack elsewhere. So he invented the tank. Zizka was undefeated in battle until dying in 1424. The Taborite cause was then taken up by a guy, this couldn't have been his real name, but he called himself Procopius. And the Taborite cause continued until he and the remaining Taborites were crushed at the Battle of Lipani in 1434. To follow all the battles in this war would take us too far afield, but bear this in mind, this Hussite War in mind, as it would enter into the living memory of Europe as a template for political revolution using religious doctrine as one of its religious doctrine as well as the desire for ethnic self-determination, ethnic independence, as justifications. 1420, May 21st. A treaty was signed at Troyes in France, Troyes. By the terms of this treaty, the King of England, Henry V, was recognized by King Charles VI, the King of France, as heir to the French throne, and, to this end, allowed to marry a French princess, the daughter of the King of France, Charles VI. The daughter was Princess Catherine de Valois. This treaty represented the high point of English triumph in the 100 Years' War, which is still going on at this point. Because of England's role in the Protestant movement, it is necessary to pause here and come to terms with the infinitely complicated dynastic situation in order to appreciate why later Henry VIII would be so desperate for a male heir that he took England out of communion with Rome. For that, we have to understand the end of the House Plantagenet. It's spelled Plantagenet. We first met these people earlier in the medieval course during the reign of King Henry II, the first Plantagenet king of England, who's the one, well, at his behest, Thomas Becket, St. Thomas Becket, was murdered. So that was way back, so now moving, that was in 1177, so now 200 years later. The end of the House Plantagenet. King Edward III was king from 1327 to 1377. His oldest son and heir was Edward, called the Black Prince, because of his armor. He wore black armor. However, his son and heir died before Edward III, a year before. So the Black Prince died in 1376. King Edward III died the following year, 1377. So when that happened, his grandson, Edward III's grandson, through Edward the Black Prince, became the next king. He became King Richard II. Richard II, grandson of Edward III, reigned from 1377 to 1399. He was the last, Richard II was the last Plantagenet king of England in the direct first son line, the direct line of primogeniture. Richard II was deposed on September 30th, 1399, accused of tyranny. And he was, murdered. He was allowed to die of starvation, so, he was murdered slowly. And he finally died on February 14th, 1400. Edward III, King Edward III, before his death, had named his third son, John of Gaunt, whom we've already met, had appointed him the first Duke of Lancaster, enabling John of Gaunt to establish his own house, House Lancaster. So even though John of Gaunt was a Plantagenet, because he was made a duke, a duke in his own right, and then that title of Duke of Lancaster would be passed on through primogeniture to John of Gaunt's eldest sons, not the king's eldest sons. So even though John of Gaunt was by birth a Plantagenet, he's considered the founder of House Lancaster. His lands were in the south of England. The House of Lancaster had as its sigil on its banners a red rose. The House of Lancaster produced 3 kings of England. John of Gaunt himself never became king, but three Lancasters were kings: Henry IV, Henry V, and Henry VI. John of Gaunt, we met previously. He was a patron and protector of John Wycliffe and of Geoffrey Chaucer, and through them was a promoter of the English language, the English vernacular, as a legitimate vehicle for literature. So, the Henrys. Henry IV was a son of John of Gaunt. Henry IV, is the one who deposed Richard II in 1399 on the grounds that he was a tyrant. So even though Henry IV, as a son of John of Gaunt, was, in terms of lineage and heritage, a Plantagenet, because he was John of Gaunt's son, he's considered the first king of the House of Lancaster. He reigned until 1413. His son, Henry IV's son, became King Henry V, the second Lancaster king of England, who reigned from 1413 to 1422. This is Henry V is made famous by Shakespeare's play, Henry V. He's the one who achieved the famous victory at the Battle of Agincourt during the 100 Years' War, which took place on Friday, October 25th, 1415, in the north of France. And it made history as one of the signature battles of history. 9,000 English against 12,000 French. At the end of it, only 112 English were dead. 10,000 French were dead, owing to the mud trapping the French cavalry charge, and they were in heavy armor, so they couldn't get themselves out. And that allowed, they were trapped, they were helpless, and that allowed them to be wiped out by the English longbowmen, firing at what were stationary targets. That is why the French King Charles VI was forced to sign the Treaty of Troyes, and submit to his daughter Catherine marrying the hated English king in 1420. After John of Gaunt, remember we met him in the first work of Geoffrey Chaucer's that he paid for, was called the Book of the Duchess, as an homage to John of Gaunt's first wife after she died. After she died, John of Gaunt took as mistress a woman named Catherine Swynford, Swynford. With her, he had an illegitimate son named John Beaufort, Beaufort. John of Gaunt and Catherine Swynford were later married, but Beaufort was born before their marriage, so he was technically illegitimate. This guy, John Beaufort's granddaughter, married a guy named Edmund Tudor, Tudor. Edmund Tudor was the first Earl of Richmond. From that marriage of Beaufort's granddaughter to Edmund Tudor, that marriage produced a son who became King Henry VII of England, the founder of the Tudor dynasty, and the father of Henry VIII, who would later take England out of the church. Okay, so how those things came together. Back to Edward III. So Edward III named his third son, John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster. Edward III named his fourth son, Edmund Langley, gave him a title too, made him Duke of York, the first Duke of York, and enabling Edmund Langley to establish his own house, the House of York, with lands in the north. The sigil of the House of York was the white rose. So you have the House of York in the north with the white rose, the House of Lancaster in the south with the red rose, both tracing their ancestry to Edward III, the Plantagenet. Descendants of the House of York took the throne away from the House of Lancaster in the 15th century. The House of York produced kings of England: Edward IV, Edward V, and Richard III. Richard III was defeated and killed at the Battle of Bosworth Field on August 22nd, 1485, by Henry VII, who established the Tudor dynasty. Henry VII, the father of Henry VIII. The first of the York kings of England, Edward IV, reigned from 1461 to 1470. He had a daughter. That daughter of Edward IV married Henry VII after Henry VII's victory at Bosworth Field. That marriage was to end the Civil War between the Lancasters and York by reuniting the two lines. So Elizabeth was descended from Edmund Langley, the Duke of York, fourth son of Edward III. Henry Tudor was descended from John of Gaunt, third son of Edward III. So they both, but of the House of Lancaster. But they were both descended from a Plantagenet, so that reunited the two. And they visually symbolize this by the Tudor dynasty. Its sigil was the Tudor rose, which was a red rose with a white rose blooming in the center, symbolizing the union. So this was after a civil war. That this marriage was to end a civil war. So having a son and heir was considered essential to maintain the continuity, because then that son could claim the loyalty of both houses, Lancaster and York. Their son, the son of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, was Henry VIII. And that's why he was so obsessed with having a son of his own, as he was afraid that without a son, then the Civil War would start again. Because the Lancaster and York lines had not died out. They each had, people they could find who had a claim on the throne, all descended from Edward III, a Plantagenet. Okay, so keep that in mind. Nothing just happens. Now Henry VIII had had a number of other personality, issues, and so this isn't the only this certainly doesn't justify what he did, but it's an explanation. Nothing just happens. That he wasn't just being stubborn and arbitrary. That in his mind he did have some reason for believing that if he did not have a son, that England might come apart again in another civil war. And that civil war was called the Wars of the Roses, because the two sigils, the red rose and the white rose. Okay, so that's the background, both the background and looking ahead toward the future. So rewinding back to the reign of Pope Martin V, the year 1420, the same year as the Treaty of Troyes, when Henry V married the French princess Catherine. The same year, something else took place, not at all related to this, but is also going to affect church history in another way, which brings us back to Italy. In that same year, 1420, an Italian artisan named Filippo Brunelleschi began work on a dome for the cathedral in the city of Florence. All right, so his name, Filippo, last name Brunelleschi, Brunelleschi, lived from 1377 to 1446. The Cathedral of Florence was Santa Maria del Fiore, Holy Mary of the Flower. Brunelleschi was born in Florence, trained as a goldsmith, self-taught engineer and architect. The city leaders, the Signoria, the city council in Florence, there was a church. It was functional and used, but it didn't. Part of it was open to the sky. The intersection of the nave, the central aisle with the transept, that was open. Because sometimes it took generations to build these huge cathedrals. So they did not want. They wanted to finish it, but they did not want to finish it with flying buttresses on their cathedral, as the flying buttresses were the Gothic style, which was a French style, and they didn't want a French style because they were Italians. So they wanted a dome on their church. There were ancient Roman buildings like the Pantheon in the city of Rome that had a dome. So, they knew domes were possible. But the engineering techniques that the ancient Romans used to build that dome, that had been lost. So in order to put a dome on the Cathedral of Florence, engineering techniques had to be rediscovered from antiquity, or guessed, or just, other techniques reinvented. In 1404, Brunelleschi had gone to Rome with a fellow Florentine artist named Donatello to study the physical remains of antiquity, the old Roman buildings, to try to figure out how they were made. This was parallel to what Petrarch had earlier done in studying, finding, and studying the written remains of antiquity. They each had their own interest. Donatello focused on excavating and studying old Roman sculptures, see if he could figure out the techniques they used to make them look like they're moving. While Brunelleschi studied the buildings, trying to figure out the engineering of surviving basilicas and the dome of the Pantheon, see if he could figure out how they handled the distribution of weight without the buildings falling. He studied it enough to the point that he was confident that he could claim, he was confident that he could put a dome over the church in Florence. So the Signoria commissioned him to do it. It took him 16 years. It began in this year, 1420, and was completed in 1436. By the time it was done, the dome was 144 feet in diameter, 171 feet high. Now, in the end, his confidence he was not complete. He was too fearful to attempt a true hemispherical dome like the Pantheon had. So instead, he made the dome an octagon. It had an octagonal base. So technically, it's not a dome. Technically, it's an inwardly aligned polyhedron of arches with conjoined circular apex rather than a dome, but close enough. It's an octagonal cupola, to put it another way. Nevertheless, it is historic. I mean, I'm kind of teasing, but it was not. I mean, I'm serious. It was not a true hemispherical dome, but still, it was an astounding achievement in engineering. Because he was not making up. I mean, but he had redeveloped these techniques just from studying ancient Roman buildings. He was doing something that hadn't even been attempted in centuries. So it is a stunning achievement, especially considering it's still there. That dome is still there, still standing. And its octagonal shape, the octagonal base, merely highlights that it's a transitional piece, which contributed to reviving the engineering techniques that enabled later churches to have true domes like St. Peter's. The current St. Peter's Basilica is topped with a true hemispherical dome. Okay, he started that in 1420. 2 years later, back to England, 1422, King Henry V, the victor at Agincourt, died on August 31st. He died of dysentery. He was followed on the throne by his 9-month-old son, Henry VI, who was the third king of the House of Lancaster. He reigned from 1422 to 1461. As the son of an English king and a French princess, Henry VI had a claim on the throne of France, which is why the 100 Years' War continued, because the same year King Charles VI of France died, and King Henry VI of England had a claim on the French throne, but he was still a child and unable to press the claim. So Charles VI's son claimed the title King of France as Charles VII, and he reigned from 1422 to 1461. The military strength of England in France, England won the Battle of Agincourt, so the English still had troops in France. So the English presence in France was such that Charles VII could not, even though he claimed to be king, he could not actually be crowned until 7 years later in 1429. And that was owing to the aid of Saint Joan of Arc, or Jeanne d'Arc in French. Okay, back to the Pope. Between 1422 and 1429, Pope Martin V issued a series of papal decrees against anti-Semitism, against persecution of Jews. He ruled that Jews could not be evicted from their property just because they were Jews. I mean, that they could not be evicted without due process, without going through the court system and providing some legal justification. Further, he forbade priests from preaching against Jews for Judaism alone, just for being Jews, because such sermons often resulted in violence. And he forbade the compulsory or the secret baptism of Jewish children against the wishes of their parents. 1423. According to the Decree Frequens of the Council of Constance, church councils had to be summoned at stipulated intervals. Pope Martin V's entire pontificate was aimed at restoring stability and trust in the church. He never conceded the legitimacy of Frequens, since it was passed when the Holy See was sede vacante. Yet he nevertheless did summon a council as a gesture meant to instill trust in the post-Avignon, post-schism papacy. He announced that a council was to meet at Pavia in northern Italy, outside of Milan, on September 22nd, 1423. However, an outbreak of plague caused him to move it to Siena. But because of the plague, attendance was sparse, so it disbanded without achieving really anything. The following year, 1424, another step in the Renaissance. The Brunelleschi's dome was a huge step, representing that the Renaissance was moving from the written word into the plastic arts. I mean the architecture. 1424, another one of those physical manifestations of the Renaissance was created. That's still there, which is why I'm mentioning it. The famous bronze doors of the baptistry of the Cathedral of Florence, the same church that Brunelleschi was putting his dome over. There was a baptistry attached to it, and so bronze doors were put in. So these were completed by a guy named Lorenzo Ghiberti, Ghiberti, lived from 1378 to 1455. The baptistry itself is an octagonal Romanesque building under the patronage, appropriately, of St. John the Baptist. It already had, the building was already there. Ghiberti didn't build the building. And it, of course, it already had doors. The south doors had been done by Andrea Pisano in 1336. The north doors had been done by Ghiberti, completed in 1424, and later the east doors were completed by Ghiberti in 1452. And so because of this span of time, we can see in this one building, in the three sets of doors of this one building, visual chronological markers of the progress of the Renaissance in terms of the visual arts. The south doors, those were the first chronologically, were cast in bronze by Andrea Pisano, 1336. Consist of 28 panels. The top 20 depicted the life of John the Baptist. The lower 8 panels depicted the virtues: faith, hope, charity, humility, prudence, fortitude, temperance, and justice. So we see all of those cast in bronze in a late medieval style. The north doors were cast by Ghiberti. He received the commission in 1402. He completed it 22 years later, 1424. The north doors were decorated by him with 28 bronze panels, 12 depicting the life of Christ, scenes from the New Testament. The 8 lower panels depicting the 4 evangelists and the 4 senior church fathers: St. Ambrose, St. Jerome, St. Gregory the Great, Pope Gregory I, and St. Augustine. So the four senior Latin fathers. The panels themselves are surrounded by a framework of foliage, gilded, gold gilded foliage, interspersed with little golden bust of the prophets and the sibyls at the intersection of the panels. So the style is immediately, it's obviously different from the southern doors that Pisano finished in 1336. So this is almost 100 years later. These are finished almost 100 years later in 1424. And so we see visually in this one building the leap, the artistic leap from the late medieval into the Renaissance. Finally, the east set of doors, completed by the same guy as Ghiberti, commissioned the year after he finished the previous set. So commissioned in 1425, completed in 1452. The east doors had 10 panels depicting scenes from the Old Testament. The panels themselves are large rectangles and no longer embedded in the traditional Gothic quadrifoil as the previous doors had been. So yet another visual step taken. Another that you can see with this final set is Ghiberti employed the recently rediscovered principles of perspective to give depth to his compositions. Each panel depicted more than one episode. In the case of the east doors, the final set of doors. In one, the story of Joseph, this is the Old Testament Joseph, we find in that one panel that the Joseph cast into the well by his brothers, Joseph sold to the pagan merchants, the merchants delivering Joseph to Pharaoh to resell him in Egypt, Joseph interpreting Pharaoh's dream, Pharaoh paying honor to Joseph, freeing him from slavery and making him his vizier. Then Jacob, Joseph's father, sending the sons to Egypt to ask for help during the famine. Joseph recognizing his brothers and bringing his father to live in Egypt. These figures are distributed in very low relief in a perspective space. Now, this perspective, the technique in drawing was developed by Brunelleschi and Donatello based on their studies in their trip to Rome. Now, Brunelleschi applied it to architecture, Donatello applied it to sculpture in developing schiattato, which means like a flattened relief. But it wasn't really flat, so that's what these terms. So like a flattened, it wasn't flat like a painting. It was flattened in the sense that it was against a flat wall, but the figures protruded from the wall. So there was perspective, Ghiberti used different sculpture techniques, from incised lines to nearly freestanding figures. Not completely freestanding because they had to be attached to the door. And within the panels, there was further accentuating the sense of space and perspective. It's an astonishing achievement. I mean, to think how what they had to do, that do it in clay, and then make a mold, then break, make a mold of that, but in reverse, so that when they poured the bronze in, it would get, and then fit it on the door. It's a remarkable achievement. Anyway, this last set of panels also includes richly decorated gilt framework of foliage, fruits and like agricultural scenes, as well as little statuettes of prophets and other figures from the Bible. So anyway, you can look it up online and see the pictures. Completed in 1452, the set of doors was called the Gates of Paradise. And they were done in a Renaissance style, more dynamic and natural figures based on classical sculpture styles, which follows Donatello's 1430 statue, which he was done in a Renaissance style. In this way, the transition from medieval to early modern can be seen in that one single building. Before his death, Ghiberti composed a treatise on art that included a detailed description of himself and his life and how wonderful and awesome and spectacular he was. This book is the first modern autobiography of an artist and a vivid example of the Renaissance humanist fixation on the self. Okay. Also in Italy, back to Rome, June 2nd, 1424. When Martin became pope, he had two problems in the Papal States to contend with. Problem number one, the upper classes of the most powerful cities, like Florence and Bologna, had spent over 100 years effectively governing themselves. When the papacy was, in Avignon and then followed by the schism. And they were not at all receptive to the idea of bending once again to papal control. Second problem, a condottiere, a mercenary leader named Braccione di Montone, was maintaining a mercenary army in what had been the Papal States, in what was the Papal State, making a tidy living for himself and his goons by extorting protection money from the smaller cities and towns. And they were happy to pay him and his goons rather than face the pillage, burning, and destruction which would follow a refusal. And they regarded paying him off as cheaper than trying to employ their own mercenary army. So Pope Martin wanted to solve both of these problems. His strategy to resolve it was in multiple parts. First, to renew the long-standing alliance between the Papal State and the Kingdom of Naples. To that end, he negotiated a concordat with the monarch, who happened to be a queen instead of a king, Queen Joanna II. She reigned from 1414 to 1435. Strategy number two, mobilize his own relatives, the very powerful and wealthy House Colonna, which had lands and dependents all across Italy and had the resources to hire substantial numbers of condottieri. Strategy number three, to lull the thug Montone into a false sense of security by granting him a papal title, making him Lord of Perugia. Martin then used his family's private army to ambush and assassinate Montone at L'Aquila, Aquileia, on June 2nd, 1424. This scheme, and the resolution of the scheme, announced to all of Italy that the Pope meant to reassert papal dominance over the Papal State. That immediately triggered a full-scale uprising in northern and central Italy. Even with the help of his family, House Colonna, and with the assistance of Queen Joanna's troops of Naples. This revolt took 5 years to suppress, essentially a civil war in the Papal State. So it was not until 1429, 12 years after his election, that all of Italy was at peace. There was an unintended dark side to his triumph. Martin's family, House Colonna, consistently gave him support, but not out of family devotion alone. They expected compensation, and Martin had no choice but to oblige them. In this way, from the newly reconquered territories, Martin carved out principalities and distributed them to his relatives, which they could then tax for their own enrichment. The violence, on the positive side, his strategy did subdue and quell the violence and the anarchy. But in the long run, his strategy merely substituted the arbitrary rule of mercenaries like Montone for the arbitrary rule of his own relatives. Taking an even longer view, the prestige of Pope Martin and the importance of his achievements in restoring stability to the church after so long legitimized for subsequent generations the practice of clergy of all ranks using the church to enrich family members. This served to perpetuate all the problems of feudalism into the early modern period. May 16th, 1425. Pope Martin V issued an apostolic constitution concerning the lifestyle of clergy. Number 9 on the list number 9 on the list of reforms mandated by Sacrosancta, which we already talked about, called for reform of the procedure for awarding benefices cura animorum, meaning benefices with care of souls. That would be like a parish or a chaplaincy. Reform aimed at correcting the old pattern of absentee clerics neglecting care of souls because they were just sent into the church by their family for the sake of the income, and they didn't really have a vocation. Sacrosancta called for a reform of this egregious abuse, and Pope Martin issued this apostolic constitution, teaching what the later Council of Trent would codify, that a clerical life, an ecclesiastical life, must be one of simplicity, even for those ecclesiastics who were not vowed to poverty like monks were. Beyond that, the care of souls is a sacred trust, which could not be exercised through a hireling. Residence and personal exercise of pastoral ministry is essential and morally obligatory for those assigned to it. And those not willing to do it, cannot accept the benefice. Or if they, lose interest in it, then they have to give up the benefice. So from pastor to bishop to cardinal to himself, Pope Martin demanded that those who did have a benefice with care of souls must live with and tend to whatever people were in that benefice, whether it was a parish or a hospice or whatever it happened to be, or if they were chaplains to nuns or whatever it was. If the benefice had care of souls, then whatever cleric was assigned to it had to live there and actually care for the souls. This issue, of course, would not go away because money was involved, and money never, ever, ever brings out the best in people. 1427. Like concordats in the practical realm, Pope Martin V, in terms of spirituality, he revived and promoted a practice that he did not invent, but he systematized it and promoted it for its spiritual benefits, and this is devotion to the holy name of Jesus. The scriptural basis, because of course the Catholic faith is scripturally based, the scriptural basis for devotion to the holy name of Jesus is found in St. Paul's letter to the Philippians, chapter 2, verses 6 through 11. Specifically, verses 10 and 11, which read, quote, "At the name of Jesus, every knee should bend, in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess to the glory of God the Father that Jesus Christ is Lord." A confraternity of laymen, called the Holy Name Society, had been established 2 centuries earlier by Pope Gregory X at the Second Council of Lyon in 1274. Initially, devotion to the Holy Name was preached by Dominican, Blessed John of Vercelli. The devotion, he preached it as a means to counter blasphemy, reasoning that every spoken profanity was an offense to God. And so the faithful could counter that by constantly speaking with reverence the name of God's Son, the holy name of Jesus. And so the inverse was also true, that we have alone in all creation, human beings have the gift of being able to speak, to pronounce the name of Jesus. And with the same mouth, sin can be, profanity, lies can be done. So it's a way to sanctify the gift of speech, of human speech. Pope Martin revived the devotion for similar reasons, and he appointed a Franciscan, Saint Bernardino of Siena, lived from 1380 to 1444, to re-promote the devotion in this 15th century context as a centerpiece of a program of moral reform. In his preaching, St. Bernardino, the theme was that to speak the name of Jesus is a privilege that could result in condemnation for a person who took the name in vain, who spoke it unworthily. In order to enjoy the privilege legitimately, it's necessary to live a moral life so that one can speak the most holy name with the serenity of a just spirit and a clear conscience. One recurring passage in Bernardino's preaching was Psalm 51, verse 19. For those who heard this and said, well, okay, I guess I'm damned to hell because I've not always been doing that. Well, he said, no. Quoting the psalm, my sacrifice is a contrite spirit, a humbled, contrite heart, O God, you will not spurn. In 1427, Pope Martin V approved this form of devotion to the holy name and appointed Bernardino, empowered Bernardino as legatus, as a papal legate, to preach it internationally. The following year, June 1428, Jeanne d'Arc, or St. Joan of Arc, presented herself to the uncrowned King of France, Charles VII. Jeanne d'Arc was born in Domremy, Champagne, France, on the 6th of January, 1412, as the fifth child of a peasant farmer named Jacques. Evidently, she never learned to read or write, certainly not fluently. Her region at the time was controlled by the Duke of Burgundy, who, for their own reasons, political reasons, had betrayed their oaths of fealty to the French kings. So they wanted Burgundy to be independent of France, just as southern France had in the 13th century. Yeah, I should explain this, otherwise it's not going to make sense. Burgundy, or French Bourgogne, was established, as we covered much earlier in the medieval course, but to save you time, found in the video, it was established by pagan Scandinavians from the Baltic Sea, Vikings, essentially, but they weren't called Vikings yet, but that is the same ethnic group. And they carved for themselves a successor kingdom after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. It encompassed the Rhone River Valley, along with what is now western Switzerland. So the Rhone Valley in France, along with western Switzerland. In 534, that entity was absorbed by conquest into Merovingian France. In 843, it changed hands by conquest again, coming in under the control of the Holy Roman Empire. Like Alsace-Lorraine, the territory of Burgundy changed hands many times over the ensuing centuries between France, Germany, and at times independent, depending on how wealthy and powerful the Duke of Burgundy happened to be. So by this period, by the 15th century, it was technically a duchy of France, and the Duke of Burgundy was a vassal owing fealty to the kings of France. However, in actuality, partially because of the 100 Years' War, which is still going on, it was an obscenely wealthy commercial enterprise with its capital at the city of Dijon. Its dukes supported the English against the King of France, against their own overlord in the 100 Years' War, not out of love of England, but because they wanted the French king to stay weak so that the Dukes of Burgundy would retain their de facto independence. With this background, in the year 1425, Jeanne d'Arc began receiving infused graces, initially in the form of locutions from St. Michael, St. Margaret, St. Catherine, and others. In June of 1428, 3 years later, she presented herself to Robert Baudrincourt, who was commanding a garrison at Vaucouleurs in the name of the Prince Dauphin, who was the heir. He was the heir of Charles VI. He would later become King Charles VII, but at this point he was uncrowned, so technically he was still the Dauphin, which is the French equivalent to the Prince of Wales, the heir apparent. She told Robert Baudrincourt of her belief that she was called by God to come to the help of Prince Charles. Initially, Robert chased her out of camp, thought she was just, some crazy illiterate peasant looking for attention. The same year, 4 months later, on October 12th, 1428, the English and their Burgundian allies laid siege to the city of Orléans, a city in north-central France on the Loire River, strategically vital. Whoever was going to run France had to control it. It was on a line about 75 miles directly south and slightly west of Paris. So about a 3-day march from Paris, maybe 4, depending on how many infantry. In January of 1429, the following year, with the siege of Orléans still underway, Jeanne again went to the same guy, Robert Baudrincourt, at Vaucouleurs, saying that God had commanded her to come and help. Now, Robert was still skeptical, but things weren't really going his way, so figured he didn't have much to lose. Further, she was able to reveal to him knowledge of events that were only later confirmed to have taken place at the time she said them. So he decided not to risk the possibility that she was telling the truth and him obstructing her. So he sent her with an escort of only 3 men. So he wasn't going to risk too much. A three-man escort for her to meet the Dauphin, the uncrowned King Charles. At the time, he was staying at Chinon in Anjou, which is 100 miles southwest of Orléans. The group arrived on March 6, 1429, and was granted an audience with Charles on March 8th, 2 days later. To test her, the prince disguised himself and had someone else pretend to be him, to see if she would fall for it. But she did not. She went straight directly to him. And that impressed him, so he spoke to her privately. The details were never revealed. Neither she nor he ever committed them to writing. But after the meeting, whatever happened, he declared his belief in the authenticity of her divine guidance. Some at court, when they heard about her locutions, some of them feared, they didn't doubt that she was hearing things, but they feared that it might be of demonic origin. That might be trying to lure, to use her to lure the prince's forces into an ambush. And he took that and said, well, okay, maybe, I believe she's sincere, but maybe she's being deceived by the demonic. So he sent her to the Bishop of Poitiers to examine her, which the bishop did along with some of his advisors. They declared that there was nothing heretical or demonic in any of her claims or actions or recommendations. Later, when the English captured her and orchestrated their drumhead trial of her, the records of this examination, this initial examination, were stolen and destroyed, so they could not be used to vindicate her. On April 30th, 1429, this time empowered by the prince to act on his behalf, she led reinforcements to Orleans, and by May 8th, the English and the Burgundian troops retreated. Though Jean took an arrow to the chest in part of the fighting on May 7th, but she recovered. She then moved to clear the strategically vital Loire River Valley, culminating in a victory at Patay, which permitted Prince Charles to finally enter Reims, the city of Reims, which was the traditional place where French kings were crowned. Reims is about 140 miles northeast of Orleans, and there he was finally crowned as King Charles VII on Sunday, July 17th, 1429. The next objective was to liberate the city of Paris from the English occupation. Jean led an assault on September 8th, 1429, which, for reasons entirely beyond human understanding, the new King Charles VII did not support, either in person or with the dispatch of reinforcements. Even though she was fighting for him to give, the capital back to him. In the course of the fighting, Jean took an arrow to the thigh and had to be carried off the field by the Duc d'Alençon. King Charles VII then signed a truce with the Duke of Burgundy, though not with the English. So Charles was trying to divide them, and ordered Jean to lay down her arms at Saint-Denis. In April of 1430, so the following year, the Burgundians broke the truce with Charles and attacked Compiègne, 50 miles northeast of Paris. Jean went to relieve the city militarily, but again without the French king's overt support. So she had only 500 people, men who were, following her, really, just loyal to her. On the evening of May 24th, 1430, she made a sortie, and the garrison commander of Compiègne, even though she was there to help him, his name was Guillaume de Flavy, raised the drawbridge, leaving her and her men trapped on the wrong side of the moat outside of the city. In this way, she was captured by John de Luxembourg, who was in the service of the Burgundians allied to the English. Supporters of Jean believed, and I do too, I believe too, that de Flavy had been bribed by the Burgundians or the English or both to do so, to cut her off and leave her abandoned. While others, in light of subsequent events, believed that King Charles VII himself betrayed her and ordered de Flavy to dispose of her as a potential threat to his position. Whichever is the case, who knows. But what is known is that after her capture, Charles VII made no effort to ransom her or offer to exchange important prisoners for her return, which was standard practice in feudalism. And that would have worked because Jean de Luxembourg, the guy who captured her, had in fact sold Jean to the English. And the English, once they had her, they decided that simply cutting her throat, just murdering her in a dungeon, was not sufficient, that her reputation had to be destroyed. So that's the background where they decided to put her on trial for witchcraft and heresy. Her capture took place ecclesially within the Diocese of Beauvais. That city was in the hands of the French. But the bishop of Beauvais, Pierre Cauchon, had been bribed by the Burgundians. He was a paid creature of the Burgundians. The trial was moved to Rouen, which was in French hands. Because, remember, Jean was from Champagne, which at the time was within the Duchy of of Burgundy. So there was some fear that there might be a spontaneous rescue attempt, because there were people who still believed in Jeanne and were devoted to her. So they moved it to Rouen, which the English had firmly in their hand, was very, very well fortified. More importantly, Rouen had no bishop at the time, owing to the chaos of the war. So Bishop Cauchon, the Bishop of Beauvais, planned to prosecute her in Rouen, which had no bishop. So without a sitting bishop, canonically its tribunal was not legitimate. Now Bishop Cauchon could have put her on trial in his own diocese with his own tribunal, but he didn't do that. He did to Rouen. So this shows he was, paid by the English to do this. Chronologically, before we move, because this went on for a while, but the same year, 1430, the Florentine-born sculptor Donatello, whom we've already met, completed another historic work of art. It was a sculpture titled David at the Bargello, Bargello. Historically significant because it was the first freestanding bronze statue cast in the Renaissance. Now, we saw Ghiberti do bronze on the doors of Florence, but and they were three-dimensional in the sense that they were attached to the wall, but they did have, it wasn't just flat, it wasn't etched, but they were still not freestanding because they were attached to the wall. This David at the Bargello was the first, this like freestanding, standing on its own, not attached to anything else, bronze statue in the Renaissance. So, and a second reason it's historic is it is the first statue rendering the human figure nude since antiquity. So that this shows, another step, because like rendering a figure nude would have been unthinkable in the Middle Ages. So that this is showing not only the advance of sculpture in terms of technique, but also the change in social mores, and that this was acceptable, not only to render the human figure this way, but to render a religious figure in this way. Curiously, Donatello had started his career with a sculpture of David. In 1408, he sculpted David in marble, but he was fully clothed in armor with Goliath's head at his feet. It was strongly medieval in style, yet he lived long enough. And now, 1430, a generation later, he made the transition into the early modern period, in which the concept of modesty in art was discarded and the human form objectified. Okay, Pope Martin V died the following year on February 20th, 1431. He would be followed as Pope 207 by Pope Eugenius IV. Before he died, Martin summoned another council. This one was scheduled to meet at Basel, but he died before it met, leaving it as a topic for the next reign. And also, he died with the trial of Joan d'Arc unresolved. So we'll pick up all that in the next video on Pope Eugenius IV. So for now, thank you for your attention. This session is adjourned.